Second. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Church of Grace. My name is Patrick Hayes. Today is Friday, August 2nd, I've been told. And we are in Matthew chapter 16. We are in Matthew part 37. We've been going through the book of Matthew for 36 evenings, and we're in part 37 now. Finish up chapter 16, and then we are going to start chapter 17. And there's a couple, the last several verses in chapter 16 are really kind of, I don't know what you want to call it. They're challenges that we get from the Lord. The Lord really gives us a charge, and it's not an easy one. He sets the bar high, and he tells us what he expects out of us in our lives as a Christian, and it's tough. It's tough to swallow. Then we get into 17, and we really get into a wild event, and we call that the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus shows up in front of Peter, James, and John in his true form. So we're going to read Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 to 28, and then we'll jump in a verse at a time. Okay, starting in verse 24. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his own soul? For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. All right, so starting in verse 24, Jesus said, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Is this a prerequisite for salvation? I heard someone say it. I heard someone whisper. No, it's not. Of course not. It is what should come out of salvation. So remember, and we're gonna go over this idea here. I'm going to write a few words on the board, and this is important to understand. And there are a lot of groups that mix these up, and this is where they get in trouble. We have justification, we have sanctification, and we have glorification. Justification is when our sins are forgiven. This happens by the grace of God when we place our faith in who Jesus is and what he did. Remember, there are works involved with salvation. They just ain't mine. They're what Jesus did on the cross a couple thousand years ago. It is his work on the cross that allows my sins to be forgiven. There is nothing I can do to earn justification. It is by him and him alone, the work that he did. This is how I get saved. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, we read, For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, not of works, lest any man should boast. It is by grace through faith and not of us, not of our works. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. It's a great verse. If you ever want to have a short list of verses to memorize, that's one you got to get on there. So then after justification comes sanctification. And sanctification is the process that begins at the time of justification. So once we're saved, the Holy Spirit of God enters our body. And literally, God takes up residency inside us. He lives inside of us. And God starts a process. The process of sanctification is us conforming to the will of God. Hopefully, as a Christian, we do less of our own will and more of God's will. We look less like ourselves and more like Jesus. That's the goal. No matter where you come into this game, whether you are the chiefest of all sinners, which is what Paul said about himself, the Apostle Paul, whose job, Paul could put on his resume, murderer of Christians. Do you realize that? That was his job. The Sanhedrin sent him to towns to find the Christians, drag them out into the street, and stone them to death. That's what was going on. Paul started out pretty bad. If you ever feel bad about yourself, just read a little bit of the book of Acts. You'll find, okay, you're doing pretty well. Okay? If we start there, or if we start as someone who, you know what, Patrick, I grew up in a Christian home. I went to church most of my life. My parents were serious. They trained me to be a good and kind and sweet person. And then sometime around 12 years old, I understood the gospel and I got saved. Hey, wherever we start on that, guess what? We still have a long way to go to be like Christ. And that process that starts at the time we get saved finishes on the day we die. And it finishes at glorification. Glorification is what happens for us to be able to stand before God. We're going to talk more about this when we get to chapter 17 and the Mount of Transfiguration. So I'm not going to get into it a lot, other than to say that we get a new body. You get a hardware upgrade in order to be able to stand before God. So, any questions on any of this? Okay, doing good so far. All right, verse 24. As a saved person, I am commanded to do this. Number one, I must deny myself. Now, folks, that is not a popular message in America today. I see Christian t-shirts everywhere. I never see one about Matthew 16:24. You just don't see it. Number two, I must follow Jesus. Must deny myself, must follow Jesus. Do you know following Jesus isn't even that popular in Christian churches today? Yeah, I don't want to follow that guy. I want to do this stuff over here. We're supposed to do what he says. We're supposed to be like him. And number three, we must take up our cross. Okay, so what does that mean? Mason, tell me what you think.
It's when you have those moments in the day where you have your will and God's will. So you make the conscious decision to do God's will instead of yours.
Okay, so because I'm always told, Patrick, please repeat the answers because we can't hear what they say for our folks at home. There are times in our day when we come across a turning point where we can either do God's will or our own, and we make the decision to do God's will. Does anyone want to make the argument that Jesus is literally talking about picking up a cross and dragging it up a hill so we can be executed by crucifixion from the Romans? Obviously not. Okay, this is figurative. So here's what I think, okay? Our cross is figurative, and it is analogous to the sacrifices we must make in our own life and the hardship that we must endure. So remember, and we're going to get there, we're not at the Garden of Gethsemane yet in the book of Matthew, but Jesus at one time, he prays, and when he prays to God the Father, he says, God, if there's any way to not have to go to the cross, let's do that. But not my will, yours. Yours be done. Jesus knew what going to the cross was going to be. It was going to be a sacrifice and a hardship beyond anything we could imagine. We must also go through hardships and endure them. So here's my take on it. If we are going to obey Jesus, there must be sacrifices that we make. We must sacrifice our treasure. We must sacrifice our time and our desires. Denying our will and doing the will of God is a sacrifice. Now, it's also called being an obedient Christian, but that's the idea. A sacrifice is when we're not doing what we want. We're taking our desires, we're taking our stuff, we're taking our time, and we're setting it on the altar and saying, I'm okay not getting that, and I will do this over here. Now, most people I encounter in the world should have different beliefs than I do because they are not saved and I am a born-again Christian. So my thoughts, my actions, and my beliefs should be different from everyone else. This is going to sound harsh, but it's okay. Do you want to know how you're doing as a Christian? Does everyone like it when you open your mouth? Does everyone like your take on everything? Does everyone get along with you? Because if we believe what this book says, folks, this book is countercultural. There is no more of a countercultural book on earth. When I got saved, when I first held the Bible in my hands and started to read it, I was 21 years old, and I read the book of Matthew, and I had never heard any of these ideas before. Jesus said, love your enemy. Who on earth loves their enemy? I didn't even get to chapter 8, and I couldn't count on both hands, and I took off my shoes, and I couldn't count the number of things that Jesus said that were wildly different from everything that the world has ever taught me. If we are a Christian and we believe these things, it's going to rub the world the wrong way. And my beliefs are going to make many people uncomfortable, and your life and my life will be harder if we stand up for Jesus and the Bible. If we go along with everything and we never stand up for our beliefs and for our convictions, then you're going to avoid all the hardships. Life's going to be easy. You're going to get along with everybody. It's okay. I don't need an amen there. I know it was warranted. Okay, verse 25. For whosoever will save his life will lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. This verse talks about the ramifications of not living for Jesus. If we live for ourselves, we will look back on the one and only life we get, and we will realize that we've wasted a lot of it. Now, I'm going to tell you this. Most people in society don't spend a lot of time on a person's deathbed. Sorry, I got one fly that's just fixated on ruining my night here. Pastors are different. Pastors get invited to people's deathbeds. You don't know how many times I've had a friend call me up and say, hey, my grandmother's not doing well. She's in the hospital. They think she's got a couple days left. She is mean as a snake and she hates Jesus. Will you come and talk to her? I've gotten that call. Of course I go. Now, that lady did not tell me the following, but she did get saved. Okay? And the rest of her family that showed up over the next day and a half all walked out of that room and said, who is that woman? They couldn't believe it. They said, that is not grandma. What is going on? Sweet as pie for 48 hours. You could have introduced me to her earlier. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, it wasn't me. It was the Holy Spirit. I just explained the gospel to her. She accepted Jesus. She was excited about it. When you're on a person's deathbed, people regret only two things. They regret spending more time with their family and spending more time serving the Lord. That's it. When we look back, nobody has ever said, boy, I wish I could have just put in a few more hours at the office. Nobody says that. We wish we could have done something for God, something eternal, something that's going to meet us in the hereafter. On the contrary, those of us who give up our lives to serve the Lord will really and truly find the meaning of life. You will find a contentment and a joy that you never thought was possible. There is a phenomenal book. I wrote it up here. It's not called that. It's called Through Gates of Splendor. Through Gates of Splendor. if you're a Christian, it is one of the best books you will ever read. The book is about a missionary named Jim Elliot who tried to reach the Huaorani people with the gospel back in the 1950s. The Huaorani tribe was a tribe who was so violent that even other local tribes, meaning groups of people that lived in the jungle, okay, that was their way of life, no electricity, like huts in the, like what you'd imagine, no other tribe was willing to approach that tribe because they were so vicious and they would attack and kill any stranger that ever came anywhere near them, okay? And Jim Elliot and a group of missionaries, his wife was down there with him, several missionaries went down there. They spent a long time trying to get to these people and bring them the gospel. And spoiler alert, Jim Elliot and 4 or 5 other missionaries died while trying to bring the gospel to these people when they finally reached them. Their bodies were found riddled with arrows and spears. The men had guns. They didn't even draw them. They made the decision early on. They said, nope, we absolutely cannot defend ourselves with lethal force. We would undo everything that we've accomplished, and these people will never receive the gospel. Jim Elliot wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." See, we're all wrapped up in this life because it's what's in front of us every day when we wake up. But the fact is, there's coming a day when we're going to stand before God and we're going to realize, you know what? I can't share the gospel with anyone up here in heaven. It's the one thing you can't do in heaven. So if we don't do it now on earth, we're going to find ourselves in heaven. We're going to realize, man, I wasted some of my life. Not one person is here because of me. Okay, anyway, if nothing else, get it on audiobook. It's an amazing book. So we are supposed to give our lives in order to serve Christ. And if nothing else, we should prioritize the eternal and the temporal. We should, if nothing else, understand that there are things we can do, there are things we can support that will meet us in heaven, that will be there forever. And that is what, that's what our church wants to do. We want to fill heaven. We want to fill heaven and teach the Christians here on earth the Bible. That's really what we're looking to do. All right, so I want to explain a principle that is going to determine what our church is like over, let's say, the course of the next year, okay? Because we're going over it now. So this is, I don't know how to incorporate this. Maybe we'll I don't know. What do you do as a church? Do you make a banner and hang it up on the first of the year and say this is our mission, right? I mean, that's what they usually do. So it comes down to, do we want our church to be exceptional, or do we want our church to be just another lukewarm, mediocre, average church? So Jesus and the Bible and our Christian life is not supposed to be a hobby. A hobby is something we fit into our life when we have the time. I have hobbies. You should all have a hobby. You should have a hobby. At least one hobby where you have a couple hours a week where you just waste time. All right? That's good for you. It's good for you mentally. Can be good for you physically. That's fine. It's good for you. That should not be how we describe our walk with God. Okay? Couple hours a week when I can fit it in. That's not supposed to be our Christian life. Our walk with God is supposed to be our number one priority. Jesus describes it as he is the bread of life, right? We need daily bread, we hear about in the Bible. The manna that came from heaven came down every day. They had to collect it. The Bible is called the bread of life. It's something that, it's compared to something that we need to sustain ourselves every single day. Making God our top priority, it's not easy. I understand that. It requires dedication, it requires discipline, and none of us are going to be perfect. None of us are going to be close to perfect. Do you know how hesitant I am to say to anyone, hey, I pray for you every day? Because I'm lying. If I say that to you, I'm lying. Now, I can say to everyone here, I pray for you every week. No problem. I can even say I pray for you multiple times a week. Not a liar. I have witnesses here. My family sees me do it. But I can't say I do it every day because it's really hard to be disciplined and dedicated every day without fail. So anytime you hear me say, hey, I pray for you every day, call me a liar. Has anyone heard of the Pareto principle? It's okay. It was written by an Italian socialist. I'm fine that you don't know about it. Okay, it comes from an Italian economist, Vilfredo Pareto. So a modification of his theory was later called the law of the vital few. And today it is most often called the 80-20 rule. Anyone ever hear of that? Okay, everyone's heard of that. So 80% of outcomes arise from 20% of causes. It's a statistical anomaly that you can apply to so many things. It's really fascinating. So 80% of revenue comes from 20% of a company's services. So this is an important idea in economics because if your company provides 100 services, you're going to find that 20% of them provide 80% of your revenue. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you should slowly dump 80% of the services you provide, and you should focus on the 20% that make you all the money. 80% of crimes are committed by 20% of criminals. 80% of output is produced by 20% of its workers. And in churches, 80% of the work done is completed by 20% of the people. Every church you go to. Do you know that 80% of the problems that I will deal with as a pastor come from 20% of the people? Did you all notice I'm looking up and away from everyone's gaze? Because if you look at it, if you make eye contact with anyone right now, you're in trouble. Pastor's calling me out from the pulpit again. And here's the deal. If you don't like what I just said, stop being the 20%. Amen, preacher. That's good. I needed that. It's all right. I know who you are. No, so the reason I bring this, the reason I bring this up is this. I need 80% of the people in this room to greet a first-time visitor when they walk in the door. That's what I need. I don't need 20% of you to do it. I need 80% of you to do it. And I need you to learn their name, and I need you to chat them up for a sec. First of all, my apologies, Al and Elizabeth, because now everyone is going to come up to you at the end of the night and try to, find out your middle name and social security number because I brought this up. But the point is that we need 80% of the people in this church to be kind and welcoming to newcomers. That's how people come in the front door and they do not run out the back. We can't have 20% of the people doing it. We will not be an exceptional church. I need 80% of the people to pray for other people in this church. All you got to do is get yourself, and this is silly, okay? This is my prayer journal. It is not full. I did not expect it to be this big, okay? I thought it was going to be much smaller on Amazon, okay? But my point is, you need a prayer journal where you write down names of people that you know. Many of them should be in this church, Okay, your family should be in there too, and some neighbors, and who you'll work with, and God knows the entire IRS because they're all going to hell. Okay, so we need a lot of names in this book, but my point is that you need to be able to pray for these people once a week, and you need to be able to call them, and when God puts them on your heart, you need to be able to call them and say, hey, I was praying for you this week about that thing that you told me that you were going through and struggling with. You know, you're only going to learn what they're going through and what they're struggling with is if you hang out a little bit and you get to know people. I need 80% of the people in this church to hang out for 15 to 20 minutes after church. Not an hour. You don't have to be in the hour crew. That's fine. Get to know some folks, get to know their burdens. We need to lift each other up in prayer. Do you know why? You know why people that come from really big churches, they always tell me the same thing. They're like, Patrick, nobody knew who I was. I felt like I could walk in, I could hear what they did, I could walk out, nobody knew my name, nobody knew what was going on in my life. That can happen in a small church just as easily. Guess how we fix that? Stop being the 20%. Be the 80%. Okay. This has nothing to do with the Bible. Be the person that takes someone out for lunch on their birthday. What's it going to cost you? $40? Everybody loves that person. Wow, that person knew my birthday, and they were thoughtful enough to invite me to go get a sandwich on my birthday. They called me in the morning and they said, happy birthday, I was praying for you, let's get lunch this week. You will be their hero. You will be talked about by that person to everybody they know for weeks. That's the amount of effort it takes to be exceptional. The bar is down here in America today. It doesn't take much. Here's my challenge. Be that person in church. Be the person in church that says, you know what? I'm going to get to know everyone a little bit, and I'm going to pray for them. Do you know, you don't have to be rich to do that. You don't need to be successful. You don't need to be talented. You don't need to read the Bible. You don't need to know the Bible. And you can be that person that warms the heart of everyone in church because you put in this much effort. That's what it's going to take for our church to be filled with real Christians and be an exceptional church. It doesn't take much. I need 80% of the people to show up when we have a church workday or a men's breakfast or whatever. When people in this church need help, do we all show up to help them, or do we think, they don't need me, someone will show up? 80, 20. Stop being the 20. That's the mission. Okay. Again, not a big amen message, but that's fine. Verse 26, we'll just move on. Okay, this verse takes a turn and talks about our eternal state. Now, we know in verse 26 that Jesus is talking about salvation because here he speaks using the singular pronoun he. In verse 25, Jesus talks about whosoever. In verse 27, Jesus is talking about every man. If you focus on the grammar in the Bible, it helps explain a lot. Jesus is talking about what does it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? There, I didn't write the guy's name up here. The name of the French mathematician is Blaise Pascal, and he had a neat kind of theory. I don't know. Well, I don't want to draw a chart. I feel like I'm already late. He said, look, if you put your faith in Jesus and God does exist, you will gain eternal bliss. If God does not exist and you put your faith in Jesus, you lose very little. If you do not put faith in Jesus and God does exist, you suffer eternal torment. If you do not put your faith in Jesus and God does not exist, you lose very little. Statistically speaking, we are a fool if we don't put our faith in Jesus. It does not matter what we gain in this life if we spend eternity in the lake of fire. Somebody say amen. If anyone doubts their salvation, get saved. What is the other option? Is the other option wait until I die hoping I'm saved? That is insane. Romans 10:13, my favorite verse in the whole Bible. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. If we are not sure that we are going to heaven when we die, just do it. Why not give that which you cannot keep for that which you cannot lose? Give my life for Christ, and I get salvation which can never go away. It's an easy trade. It's a no-brainer of a choice. Verse 27. This is a verse that defines some eschatology. Big Bible word, fancy for the study of the end times. So let's look at verse 27 real quick. I'm going to read it again. For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Here's my question for you tonight, folks. Do we see Jesus come in the glory of his Father with his angels in the Gospels? No? No, we don't. We don't see that. What is this verse talking about? It is talking about the second coming of Christ. It is talking about the end times. In the Gospels, did Jesus reward every man according to his works? Nope. We don't see him do that in the Gospels either. Again, this is the second coming. Jesus teaches us about the second coming in John 14. So if jot it down, I'm going to read it now. John 14, verses 1 through 3. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples. Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. Jesus is coming back. That's great news. The Bible tells us that we are to look forward to him coming back as a great thing. We are to wait in anticipation. And by the way, the word wait is used several times in the Bible. Do you know what that means? What it's talking about, the word, okay, in English at the time when the King James Bible was translated, wait means like a wait staff. It doesn't mean sit there waiting. Okay, we are serving until Jesus comes. We're supposed to get more people together to wait. Mason, what you got? Yes, correct. Correct. Same in the Hebrew and the Greek and the New Testament. Yep, it's about serving. You got it. Yes, very good. It's an action word. Okay, verse 28. Now, many people struggle with this verse. This is the last verse in chapter 16, and we're going to get into 17. So, many people struggle with this verse. Let me read it again. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Does anyone ever struggle with that verse? Why? Because all the people Jesus was talking to there are dead, and Jesus has not shown up yet, right? So that's what we see on face value, and we're like, well, this is kind of a tough pill to swallow. Okay, obviously he means something different. I have two answers for you. The one is so common sense that you're just going to feel silly, and then the other one is my idea, which is probably wrong. So in verse 28, what Jesus is saying is simply an introduction to chapter 13. I'm sorry, not 13. The last verse in chapter 16 is an introduction to chapter 17. What happens in chapter 17? Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration. And what do we see? We see Jesus in his glorified body in a totally different form. Okay, now not everyone there, but three people saw it. There were 5 that were present. We'll get into that. Anyone want to know the other idea? Now, I tell you this just because someone is going to bring it up and give you a hard time. So here's what we have, okay? We have this little stick figure is going to represent all of the disciples. Here is the crucifixion of Jesus. Here is 40 days later when he ascends up into heaven. And here we're going to call, let's call it 110 AD. By this point, all the disciples are deceased. We good with that timeline? Now, the way Jesus is talking, we think, well, should see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Okay, now, here's what I'm going to tell you. Right here in 100 AD, what happened? The last book of the Bible was written. Who wrote it? John, the Apostle John. The book of Revelation is John was exiled on the Isle of Patmos. Jesus comes to John, gives him the book of Revelation. Now, here's what we all think the book of Revelation is. Let's call this the end times, which, doesn't really end there. That's where it starts. There's stuff that happens. But this is where it starts. We have the rapture. We have the 7-year period of what people incorrectly call the Great Tribulation. We have the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ, talked about all over the place. But this is where it all starts. And then we have in the book of Revelation, and if this is over your head, forgive me. Just bear with me. We'll get there one day. You have all the wrath of God poured out. You have all the different big events happening. It's a very exciting book. And we think, well, all of these guys died ahead of time, except for this one guy, John. And what we believe is that Jesus, who is living up in heaven, preparing a place for us, we believe that Jesus comes down here and gives John a vision, right, of the book of Revelation. And John gets this vision of the end times, and he writes about it. Okay, what I think happened, and this happens with the prophet Ezekiel as well, is that John gets brought to this point and gets to see what happens. The Lord does this with many prophets throughout the Bible. This isn't a weird concept, where he takes a prophet and brings them to Jerusalem and they get to witness what's going on. So we could either say, okay, God told them all that, or God brought them there to be able to see it. Don't ask me the mechanics of it. I don't know how that works. I guarantee this, if he did have to travel to here, he had to exceed at least 88 miles per hour. Okay, that was a joke. That had to do with the Back to the Future, Marty McFly. The DeLorean had to go, whatever. That was the best joke of the night. Okay. So what I believe is that the Apostle John, Jesus brought him to see this. I don't think John was boots on the ground, but I think he saw the whole end times. He describes it in the book of Revelation. My point is, one of the apostles saw everything Jesus was talking about before he died. He even wrote a book about it. So there are a couple of explanations as to how verse 28 in Matthew 16 could work. All right, let's try to get through a little bit of this before we stop. Yeah, we got a few minutes. Matthew chapter 17, let's read verses 1 through 9. We're not going to get through them all, but we'll get started. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and behold, a voice out of the cloud, which said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their face and were sore afraid. And Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, and be not afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no man save Jesus only. And as they came down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, saying, Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead. So in verse 1, we see there is an inner circle. Now, we've talked about this before. When we're talking about the disciples, we typically think of the 12, right? The 12 apostles. But we find out that there was an inner circle, and that inner circle had 3 fellas, and their names were Peter, James, and John. And we find out in Matthew, I think it was 9, where Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus. Peter, James, and John were allowed in the room, and they saw that miracle. No one else did. Here at the Mount of Transfiguration, again, Peter, James, and John. At the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John. So this was a small group that got to see some miracles that the rest of the apostles, the rest of the 12, did not get to see. And then if you add Andrew, there's one more instance we call the Olivet Discourse, where not 3 but 4 guys got a special peek into the end times. This mountain that we're talking about is either Mount Tabor, which is right here. These are the 2 things you're going to find if you look it up. Where was the Mount of Transfiguration? I do not believe it was Mount Tabor. There's a handful of reasons. None of them are interesting. And then you have Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is not in present-day Israel. It's on the border of Lebanon and Syria. And it's the northernmost area that we find in the nation of Israel. Mount Hermon is not really mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Mount Tabor is mentioned several places. That's all I'm going to do as far as the geography. Let's see. Okay, so in verse 2, Jesus was not standing there in a physical body that he was born in. That's the deal. Jesus was standing there in his incorruptible body. He was standing there in his spiritual body. And I'm going to explain this. First, do we all understand that our physical frame cannot stand before God? And I'm not talking about Jesus, because understand, although Jesus is 100% God, he took on human form. So he took on physical flesh. This same flesh that is cursed to die because of sin, that cannot seem to help but sin, Jesus was able to resist every temptation that we have all been tempted with, but not sin. We can stand next to Jesus because Jesus took on the form of man. But as far as God, okay, Elohim, in his complete glory, we are unable to stand before him. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai, he asked God if he could see him. And he said, Moses, we can't do it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to hide you back here in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to pass by, and you're just going to see the train of my garment. Okay, that was the long piece of the robe that dragged on the floor behind him. He said, you can take a glance at that. And that was almost too much for him. He came down the mountain, his face was shining like the sun. That's what they said. So we do not stand before God in his completeness. The reason we don't do that is because we're made of flesh. So when we get to glorification, when we die, or when the rapture takes place and we are taken home to heaven, our bodies will be changed. And we get a new glorified body, uncorruptible, incapable of sin. This is explained in 1 Corinthians, both in chapter 15 and I think in chapter 14. We're going to get there. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 53. This is Paul, the apostle, explaining what happens in the end times. Now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. You understand? Why not? Our flesh and blood is sinful. Folks, if there was sin in heaven, it'd be just like earth. There's no sin in heaven. Neither doth corruption inherit incorruption. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. What does Paul mean when he says we shall not all sleep? First of all, what does Paul mean when he uses the word sleep? Yes and no, not just die. He means dying, but who is dying? Saved people. Why does he call the death of a saved person sleep? Yeah, it's temporary. We close our eyes in death. We open our eyes in newness of life with the Lord at our side. Okay, so that's why he uses the term sleep, but only when he's talking about saved people. Okay, he says, we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Oh, how? Well, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. When's the last trumpet? Bible defines the last trumpet. The last trumpet, I already erased never mind. The last trumpet is when the rapture happens. Okay, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 or chapter 4 maybe it is, when we read it, he uses the same verbiage here so we understand the timeline that we're talking about. The second coming of Christ, there's going to be a trumpet blast. So at the last trumpet, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So notice, all those who have died before, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, going all the way back, every saved person in the world whose body is in the grave, okay, those who died at sea, it says in the Bible, in Revelation, that the sea will give up their dead, and those bodies will be changed. They will shoot up to heaven, and they will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. How fast is that? I don't know, but it sounds quick. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. Our physical body, made of flesh and prone to sin, will not enter heaven. We will get a new, glorified body. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 to 44. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. Sown in corruption. What do we do with seeds when we sow a seed? Dig a little hole, put it in the ground, cover it with dirt. What is he talking about? He is talking about the resurrection of the dead. What do we do with the dead? Bigger hole. Stick them in the ground. Push dirt over it. Okay, we're talking about the dead. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. That's what Paul says. There is a natural body we are living in now. There is a spiritual body that we will get when we go to heaven. That changing is called glorification. That is the last stage of salvation. Anyone who is saved is currently, if you're alive, okay, which most of you look like you are, we are all going through the process of sanctification. One day, we will be glorified. Any questions on any of this? Mason, Then Joe.
The process of glorification, is that what happened to Enoch and Elijah? They just
Yes.
died? Is that why Elijah and Enoch don't have to come back so they can taste death? Because Elijah's coming back, supposedly?
So I don't know that the two witnesses are going to be Enoch and Elijah. Okay. There's an assumption. The question for everyone at home was, this process of glorification, is that what happened to Enoch and Elijah? So if you're wondering what we're talking about, Enoch, a fellow we find back in the book of Genesis, who in the genealogies in Genesis chapters 5 and 11, one of those two, it talks about Enoch being a man who did not die, and God took him. And he took him, believe it or not, right before the worldwide flood, and there's some neat stuff there, but we're not going to unpack that tonight. Then later on, Elijah, the same Elijah that we just read, is on the Mount of Transfiguration with the Lord. He also did not die. He was raptured. Okay, for those of you that struggle with the word rapture, okay, it is a Latin word. You won't find it in the Bible, but if you read a Latin Vulgate, you will read the Bible. Okay, or you will read that word. It is in the Bible. It means to be caught away quickly, to be snatched up and taken away. So Enoch was raptured. Elijah, the prophet that we're going to talk about, was raptured. And one day, prior to the tribulation, the 7 years, which we call the 70th week of Daniel, all the saved people will be raptured. I am not convinced that... Okay, so part 2 of what Mason said. It's a very good question, but there's some backstory. In the book of Revelation, in the end times, God talks about 2 prophets. He doesn't give us names. There's a big debate as to who these 2 prophets are. Lots of us do believe Elijah is probably a good one. Some people think Moses, because Moses and Elijah showed up here. Some people think Elijah and Enoch, because both of them were raptured and they didn't die, so we're thinking they're going to have a part in the end times and they're going to die. But one thing I always remind us is that death is not necessarily for all of us, and that's okay. I've never felt like the Enoch-Elijah argument means it's going to be Enoch and Elijah. It's okay if they don't die, because them not dying and being whisked away gave purpose to a message at the time, and we can, draw conclusions from it. So, good question. Short answer, I don't know. Sorry if that long answer was confusing. Anyone else have a question? Nick. Moses and Elijah? No, all we know is they left. They So the Bible does not say anywhere that I am aware of the state of the body of Moses or Elijah. The reason we're asking, now this is interesting, okay, because honestly, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Did they show tags? Okay, did they recognize them? There wasn't a lot of photography back in 4000 BC, right, when this all started. Okay, so we don't know, so that's the short answer. Noah, what you got? Okay, it's all right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, not a Rapture fan. Got it. Your friends, not you. Mm-hmm. And then bring us back down and we go through the tribulation. I agree. I think it's nonsensical. So did anyone... Oh, I can't do it. I got to leave that there. We're going to be here for an hour if I get on to my next point. Okay, we can come back and talk about it next week, but let's keep moving for 1 second. Okay, so verse 3. This verse makes me smile. Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land. In the Old Testament, Moses disobeyed God when the nation of Israel was wandering through the desert for 40 years, and his punishment was he was going to die on this side of Jordan. And the very last, one of the sweetest stories in the Bible is Moses is invited by God to go to the top of a hill and look over the Jordan River and see Canaan land. It's just him and God. And Moses dies, and God buries him. And that closes out the 5 books of Moses, the end in Deuteronomy. And then Joshua takes over, and the book of Judges starts, and he leads the nation of Israel into the promised land. But here he is. Moses got to stand in the promised land and meet Jesus. I just think that's great. Why Moses and Elijah? God could have picked a lot of folks from the Old Testament. Why Moses and Elijah? Very good. That is the answer that I had, Bill. The law and the prophets. The law came from Moses. And I consider Elijah to be the most powerful prophet. Now, there are many prophets that wrote down many amazing things, but nobody exhibited the power that Elijah did. Elijah called down fire from heaven on the enemies of God. Elijah caused the rains to stop and a drought for 3.5 years, and then Elijah caused it to rain again. God did magnificent, mighty works by the prophet Elijah. And everybody in the Old Testament who thinks of the law and the prophets thinks of the mighty prophet Elijah. Now, there is one more big difference between Moses and Elijah. What is the big difference? It was already discussed tonight. Mason? One died and one was raptured. And they represent all the saints from before who died and are awaiting the second coming and the resurrection, and all the saints that will be alive at the time who will be caught up together. Okay, verse 4. What do we got to be at? We got to be out of time. Yeah, we're out of time. Why would Peter suggest this? First of all, why is Peter even opening his mouth? Clearly, this is a big, important meeting. Okay, let me give everyone a tip. When the boss comes in and calls a meeting, and then like the regional vice president shows up, don't talk. Okay? It is not your time. They didn't all gather there to listen to you. Just shut up and sit there sipping your coffee and let the main event do the talking. So if you're ever in a room with Jesus and Moses and Elijah shows up, they didn't come to hear from you. Okay, so Peter didn't get that lesson, and literally the next verse, God interrupts him. Big booming voice from heaven, he interrupts Peter. Okay, why did Peter suggest, let's make some tents here for these guys? Here's a hint. We think it was close to the fall. What happens in the fall, that time of year? It is called the Feast of Tabernacles. Very good. Every Jewish travels to Jerusalem and spends a week in a tent sleeping outside. That's the Feast of Tabernacles. I don't know that to be true. There are some reasons I think that. Either way, it doesn't matter. I think Peter just stuck his foot in his mouth. He opened his mouth when he should have stayed silent. And look at verse 5. While he yet spake. So while Peter was talking, God interrupts him. We're going to stop there. Verse 5 is an awesome verse, and we're going to go over a little bit. And you guys have already been very gracious by letting me go a little late. So thank you for that. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to close in a word of prayer. We're going to give it 5 minutes of snack time and coffee and go get your kids and do whatever you want. You can skedaddle if you don't want to be here. And we have to go over a small meeting about the place we are hopefully going to be moving into in the coming weeks. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Dave, would you be so kind as to close us in a word of prayer?